Okay, so let's get into chapter 2 of Galatians. Now, hopefully you've already read this in preparation for today. And we see that Paul is going to continue telling his story in verse 1. He picks up where he left off in chapter 1. It says, "Then after 14 years," Paul says, "I went up to Jerusalem again with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me." Now let's look at the backstory of this whole book, this whole letter. The backstory is found in Acts chapters 9 through 11. Acts chapter 9 tells us the story of the conversion of Saul. Remember that Saul is Paul. And so when he got converted, he had a name change. And go back and read that if you don't know the story, but he basically gets converted. And verse 15 tells us why. God says it like this. He says, he's revealed himself because Paul is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. Now remember, Gentiles are non-Jews. And so this was a new thing that God was doing. He was choosing Paul, and he was going to open up this gospel message to everybody, not just the Jews anymore. In fact, in Acts chapter 10, he reveals himself to Peter, one of the other apostles, and he gives him this revelation. Again, you can go back and read about the revelation if you have time. But basically, here was the message in this revelation, this dream that he gave to Peter. He says, "What God has made clean, do not call common," or do not call unclean. And what he meant by that was, don't call Gentiles unclean, because I actually have called them clean. And we'll see how he cleanses them. He cleanses Gentiles the same way he cleanses Jews. And it's not by their works, it's by the work of Jesus on the cross. Now later on in Acts chapter 10, Peter goes and shares the gospel message with some non-Jews, Cornelius and his family. And he found out, he learns to his surprise that they received the gospel message. And so it says here, so Peter opened his mouth and said, "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." This is really important. Make sure you read this verse again. What he's learning, what Peter is learning, is that in every nation, anyone who fears God can come into his family, not just Jews, but also non-Jews or also Gentiles. In fact, he goes to Jerusalem and he explains this story in Acts chapter 11 to the believers in Jerusalem. And it says in verse 18, "When they heard these things, they fell silent and they glorified God, saying, 'Then to the Gentiles also God has granted repentance that leads to life.'" Remember, this was news to them. They didn't expect that God was going to treat the Gentiles like this. So we see that God was revealing the same gospel to Peter and to Paul. And that's part of Paul's point in Galatians chapters 1 and 2, is that the same message that God was revealing to Peter through the vision in Acts 10, and then when he came and explained it to the others in Jerusalem, Paul was getting the exact same revelation from God. And here's what it is, that Gentiles and Jews can all get in. Christianity isn't just a Jewish thing. It's for Gentiles too. Remember, that was a shock to them at the time. And the way you get in is by faith, not by works. You get in by putting your trust in Jesus, not by becoming Jewish or obeying all of the Jewish food laws or all of the ceremonies from the Old Testament and all that stuff. That you get in by faith, not by works. So now back to Galatians chapter 2. So Paul says, "I went up to Jerusalem because of a revelation." Again, Paul's talking about a revelation about what we just explained, that Paul had that same revelation that Peter had. And he says, "I set before them the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain." In other words, what he's saying is Paul went to Jerusalem to talk to Peter and to the others to make sure that they had the gospel right, to make sure that they were all teaching the same thing. And again, what was that thing? That you get in by faith, not by works. So look at what he says in verse 3. He says, "But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek." So it's important for you to understand what he's saying here. He's saying, when I got up to Jerusalem and I had Titus, this Gentile, who wasn't circumcised, which was a Jewish thing, he says, we all got together and everyone agreed he didn't have to be circumcised. Why? Because you're not saved by works. You don't have to become Jewish first to become a Christian. This was a groundbreaking revelation for Peter and Paul. And what we find out here is they all got it right. They all believed the same thing. But there were false brothers who didn't believe it. There were false brothers who had the gospel wrong. Verse 4, it says, "Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Jesus Christ, so that they might bring us into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission, even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you." Now we're going to stop there for now so you can talk a little bit about this, but it's really important for us to understand that Paul is talking about getting the gospel right. Make sure you get the gospel right. Now I want to encourage you to pause here and talk. Put in your own words the teaching of the false brothers, and then ask this question: are guys like this still around today? And then we'll see you in the next video.